Most night shifts are quiet. You sit behind a counter, watch empty hallways, listen to machines humming in buildings where everyone else has gone home. Gas stations, motels, hospitals, warehouses, roadside diners, places that feel safe during the day. But at night, they become something else. Because when you work the night shift, there is usually only one other person around. One customer, one driver, one visitor asking for help. And sometimes, that person is the wrong one to trust. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Tonight's stories all happen during the quietest hours of the night, when the world is asleep, and the only witness is the person working the shift. I used to work the night shift at a small gas station just outside town. It sat right off a quiet stretch of highway, the kind of road people only used if they were driving somewhere far, or trying not to be noticed. During the day, the place wasn't that bad. Truckers, commuters, people grabbing coffee before work. But the night shift was different. After about 10:30, the traffic slowed to almost nothing. By 11, it was usually just me. The station had 3 pumps out front, a little convenience store inside, and a narrow storage room in the back that led to a metal door facing the alley behind the building. That door always made me uneasy, not because anything had ever happened, just because it was the only entrance that didn't have a camera pointed directly at it. My manager used to joke about it. He said if someone ever came through that door, I probably wouldn't know until they were already standing behind me. I tried not to think about that too much. Most nights were routine. Clean the counters, restock the coolers, count the lottery tickets, brew one last pot of coffee that nobody would probably drink. Around 11:30 p.m., I would start getting things ready to close. Lock the back door, check the pumps, turn off the outdoor music, and wait for midnight. That particular night started exactly the same as every other shift. The air outside was still, the highway was quiet. Every once in a while a pair of headlights would pass in the distance, but most of them never turned into the station. I was wiping down the counter when I noticed headlights pulling into the lot. An older pickup truck, dark-colored, maybe green or black. It was hard to tell under the yellow lights above the pumps. The truck rolled slowly toward pump number 2. No music, no engine revving, just a quiet stop. I remember watching it through the window for a second. Something about the way it pulled in felt careful, like the driver was deciding something. Then the door opened. A man stepped out. He looked normal enough, mid-40s maybe, baseball cap, work jacket, the kind of person you would expect to see at a gas station near midnight. He filled up his tank first. I watched the numbers tick up on the pump display. $20, $25, $30. When he finished, he screwed the cap back on his truck and walked toward the store. The door chimed when he came in. That little electronic bell we had above the frame. He gave me a small nod. Not a smile exactly, just polite. Evening. His voice was calm, almost relaxed. I nodded back. How's it going? He walked straight to the coffee station near the hot food counter, poured himself a cup, then grabbed a small snack bar from the rack. Nothing unusual, just another late customer. Still, I remember noticing how quiet the store felt while he was inside. The refrigerators hummed, the coffee machine clicked, but the man moved slowly, like he wasn't in a hurry to leave. He brought the coffee and the snack up to the counter, set them down. I rang them up. The total came out to $4.60. He reached into his wallet, paid in cash, exact change. While I counted the coins into the register, he glanced around the store. Then he looked back at me. Long shift tonight. I shrugged. They're all long at this hour. He nodded. Yeah, night shifts can feel like they go on forever. There was something about the way he said it that made it sound like he knew exactly what that felt like. I figured maybe he worked nights somewhere too. Warehouse, trucking, something like that. It wasn't unusual around here. I handed him his receipt. He didn't take it right away. Instead, he leaned one arm lightly on the counter, studying me for a moment. Not in a threatening way, just observing. Then he said something that made me pause. You work here most nights? It sounded like casual conversation, but the way he asked it felt a little too specific. I shrugged again. Sometimes, depends on the schedule. He nodded slowly, like he was confirming something. Then he took the receipt, folded it once, and slipped it into his pocket. Before picking up his coffee, He looked back at me and said something else, something small, something that didn't seem strange at first, but later, it kept replaying in my head. He said, "I thought so. I've seen you here before." For a moment, I just stood there with the receipt still in my hand. I couldn't remember seeing him before. Working the night shift meant you started recognizing people quickly. Truck drivers, late commuters, the same few locals who stopped for cigarettes or coffee on their way home. But I was pretty sure I would have remembered this guy. He picked up his coffee and took a slow sip, still leaning on the counter. "You new here?" he asked. "Yeah, about 3 weeks." That seemed to interest him. 3 weeks. He repeated it quietly, like he was filing the number away somewhere. Then he nodded again. That makes sense. I didn't ask what he meant. Most people on night shifts talk a little strange, half tired, half bored. Conversations drift around without going anywhere. I figured this was just another one of those. He took another sip of coffee and glanced toward the windows facing the pumps. Pretty quiet tonight. Usually is after 11. He nodded again. Yeah. Then he said something that made me look up. You close around midnight, right? It sounded like a guess, but something about the way he said it didn't feel like guessing. I shrugged. Most nights. He looked satisfied with that answer, like he had just confirmed something. The silence in the store stretched for a few seconds. The refrigerators hummed behind him. Outside, a pair of headlights passed on the highway without turning in. Then he spoke again. You lock the back door around 11:32, don't you? That one caught me off guard. I blinked at him. What? The back door. He pointed casually toward the hallway that led to the storage room. You lock it before midnight. Something about the way he said it made the hair on the back of my neck rise a little. It was such a small detail, but it was exactly what I had done earlier. Every night at 11:30, I walked back there, turned the bolt, and checked the handle once before returning to the counter. It was part of the routine. I laughed lightly, just trying to brush the moment away. Yeah, something like that. He watched my face for a second longer than most people would. Then he nodded slowly again. Good habit. He straightened up from the counter and took another sip of coffee. For a moment, I thought he was about to leave. Instead, he stayed right where he was, looking around the store again. The snack racks, the empty aisles, the cooler doors glowing with white light. Then his eyes settled back on me. You work Tuesdays too? That question landed differently, not because it was threatening, just specific. Too specific. I frowned a little. Sometimes. Depends on the schedule. He smiled faintly, almost like he already knew the answer. Yeah, I thought so. There was a strange calmness in the way he spoke, like he was just confirming things he had already figured out. I felt the urge to change the subject, so I gestured toward the coffee cup. Fresh pot tonight. He glanced down at it, took another sip, then nodded. It's good. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The store felt unusually quiet. Even the hum of the refrigerators sounded louder than usual. Finally, he stepped away from the counter. Well, he lifted the coffee slightly. Appreciate it. I nodded. Have a good night. He walked toward the door slowly, not rushed, not lingering either. Just steady steps across the tile floor. When he reached the door, he stopped, turned halfway back toward me, and said something that seemed casual at the time. But later, it would bother me more than anything else he said that night. See you Tuesday night. Then he pushed the door open. The bell chimed softly as he stepped outside. For a few seconds after the door closed, I just stood there listening. The bell above the frame stopped ringing. The engine of the pickup started outside. Then the truck slowly pulled away from the pumps. Its headlights slid across the windows of the store before disappearing back toward the highway. Just like that, he was gone. I remember letting out a small breath. Not because I thought he was dangerous, just because the conversation had felt strange. Not threatening, just strange in a way I couldn't explain. I walked over to the window and watched the road for a moment. The pickup's taillights were already gone. The highway was empty again. I turned back toward the counter. The store felt quiet, too quiet. The refrigerators hummed. The coffee machine clicked softly as it cooled down. Somewhere in the ceiling vents, a fan rattled for a second before settling again. Normal sounds. But after that conversation, they seemed louder than usual. I glanced at the clock above the cigarette rack. 11:52 p.m., almost closing time. I started my routine. First the lottery machine, then the trash behind the counter. Then I grabbed the keys from the drawer. Every night, the last thing I did before locking the front doors was double-check the back hallway. Manager's rule. Back door locked. Hallway lights off. Nothing left open. Most nights it took about 10 seconds. I stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward the hallway. The floor tiles felt louder under my shoes than they should have. Maybe because the store was empty again. When I reached the hallway entrance, I stopped for a second. Not because I heard anything. Just because I suddenly remembered what the guy had said. "You lock the back door around 11:32, don't you?" The words replayed in my head. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he used to work somewhere like this. Maybe he just guessed. Plenty of gas stations locked the back door early. Still, it bothered me more than it should have. I walked down the hallway. The storage room smelled faintly like cardboard and cleaning chemicals. Stacks of soda boxes sat along the wall. The metal door at the end of the hallway was exactly where it always was. Closed. The bolt looked locked. I stepped closer anyway. Habit. Manager always said, "Never assume, always check." I grabbed the handle and gave it a quick pull. It didn't move. Locked. Exactly like it should be. I exhaled quietly. See? Nothing. Just routine. I turned the hallway light off and started walking back toward the counter. Halfway there, I slowed down. Something else the man said came back to me. "See you Tuesday night." I frowned. Tuesday. I worked Tuesday because the other night guy had classes that day. It wasn't a public schedule. Customers didn't know it. Most people didn't even know the store had different night workers. They just assumed it was always the same person. I stopped walking. Maybe he had seen me before. Maybe he guessed. Maybe he came by often. That had to be it. Still, the more I thought about it, the less certain I felt. 3 weeks. That's how long I had been working there. Not long enough for strangers to know my shifts. I walked back to the counter slowly. The empty store stared back at me. Rows of snacks, cooler lights, the glass doors reflecting the fluorescent ceiling panels. I glanced toward the parking lot again. Empty. No trucks. No cars. Just the yellow glow of the station lights and the dark highway beyond them. For a moment I considered checking the cameras. Not because I thought anything had happened, just to see when the pickup had pulled in. But then I shook my head. I was overthinking it. Night shifts do that to you. Too quiet. Too much time to think. I picked up the keys again and walked toward the front doors. Midnight was only a few minutes away. Time to lock up. Still. As I slid the key into the lock, I realized something. The man hadn't asked if I worked Tuesdays. He had said it like he already knew. I locked the front doors a few minutes after midnight. That was the routine. Once the doors were locked, the station officially closed. Anyone who needed gas could still use the pumps outside, but the store itself stayed shut until morning. Most nights after that point were quiet. Count the register, finish cleaning, wait for the morning shift. I turned the sign on the door from open to closed and walked back behind the counter. The store lights suddenly felt brighter once the outside traffic disappeared. No headlights, no cars pulling in, just the soft glow of the fluorescent panels above me. I started counting the drawer. Bills first, then coins. Normal numbers, nothing missing, nothing extra. While I was finishing, something outside caught my attention. A faint sound, not loud, just a small metallic click somewhere behind the building. I froze for a second. The station sat right next to an alley that ran behind several closed businesses. Dumpsters. Delivery doors. Old metal fences. Sometimes the wind moved things back there. Sometimes stray cats knocked things over. Still, it was strange hearing anything back there this late. I set the drawer down and listened. Nothing. The sound didn't repeat. I told myself it was probably nothing. But the words from earlier returned to my mind again. "You lock the back door around 11:32, don't you?" I glanced toward the hallway. The storage room light was still off. The door at the end of the hall was supposed to be locked. I had checked it myself. Still, manager's rule echoed in my head again. Never assume. Always check. I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter, not because it was dark, just because walking into that hallway suddenly felt different. The store was completely silent as I stepped out from behind the register. Each step across the tiles seemed louder than before. I reached the hallway entrance and turned the light on. The narrow corridor lit up in a dull yellow glow. Boxes stacked against the walls. Cleaning supplies near the sink. Nothing out of place. I walked slowly toward the metal door. The bolt looked exactly the same as before, locked. But something else caught my attention. The handle. It was angled slightly downward, just a little, like someone had tried to turn it recently. I stepped closer. The metal felt cold under my hand. I pushed the handle down gently, then let go. It returned to the same tilted position, not fully horizontal, not fully straight, just slightly moved. I stared at it for a moment, trying to remember if it had looked like that earlier. I couldn't, but something about it felt wrong. I checked the bolt again, still locked. No scratches, no damage, nothing forced. Yet the uneasy feeling stayed in my chest. I stood there another few seconds before turning away. Maybe the handle had always looked like that. Maybe I just hadn't noticed before. I switched off the hallway light and walked back to the counter. The store felt even quieter now, almost like the building itself was listening. I tried to focus on finishing the closing routine, but my attention kept drifting back to the alley behind the station, and the strange feeling that someone had been standing at that back door. I tried to focus on finishing the closing routine, but the feeling wouldn't leave. It wasn't panic, not yet, just the kind of tension that sits quietly in the back of your mind and refuses to go away. I wiped down the counter, restocked the cigarette shelf, refilled the coffee filters for the morning shift. Simple tasks. Normally they pass the time easily. Tonight they didn't. Every few seconds my eyes drifted toward the hallway again, toward the back of the store, toward that door. Finally I sighed and walked back behind the counter. If something was bothering me this much, there was an easy way to check. The cameras. The monitor sat under the register beside the lottery machine. A small black screen with 8 camera feeds. Front door, pumps, parking lot, inside aisles, and 1 camera pointed at the back hallway. I pressed the button that switched the screen from live view to playback. The timeline appeared along the bottom. I scrolled back 20 minutes, around the time the man had been in the store. The footage flickered for a second before stabilizing. There he was, standing at the counter, just like I remembered, leaning slightly forward, coffee cup in his hand, talking to me. From the camera angle, I could only see the back of my own head, but the conversation looked exactly the way it had felt. Calm, normal, almost friendly. I fast-forwarded a little. The man stepped away from the counter, walked toward the door. The bell above the frame rang as he left. Then the door closed. The parking lot camera showed his pickup pulling away. Everything normal, exactly how I remembered it. I kept watching. The empty store filled the screen again, just me behind the counter counting the drawer. The hallway camera stayed quiet. Nothing moved. No one appeared. I leaned closer to the monitor. Then something caught my attention. A small timestamp in the corner of the footage. 11:37 p.m. I frowned. That didn't feel right. I rewound a little further, back to when the man first entered the store. The door opened, the bell rang. He walked in. The timestamp read 11:31 p.m. I stared at it for a second. My shift started at 11, and every night at exactly 11:30, I locked the back door. I knew I had done it tonight. I remembered turning the bolt. I remembered checking the handle. That was the routine. But if the man walked into the store at 11:31, that meant something else, something I didn't want to think about. I switched the monitor to the back hallway camera. The footage showed the narrow corridor leading to the metal door, boxes along the wall, the sink, the same dim light. Nothing moving. I rewound the footage. 11:30 p.m. There I was, walking down the hallway, turning the bolt on the door, checking the handle, exactly like every night. I watched myself turn around and walk back toward the store. The hallway went empty. The timestamp rolled forward. 11:31, 11:32, 11:33, nothing. Then at 11:34, the handle on the door moved, very slowly, just a slight downward shift, like someone on the other side had tried to test it. My stomach tightened. I leaned closer to the screen. The handle moved again, just a little, then stopped. The door never opened, the bolt held, but the movement was clear. Someone had tried the handle, 4 minutes after I locked it. I sat back slowly. My eyes drifted toward the hallway again, the same hallway behind the counter. Dark, quiet, still. And for the first time that night, I realized something that made the room feel much smaller. The man at the counter had known about that door, before he ever walked into the store. I kept staring at the hallway camera. The screen showed nothing, just the empty corridor, the metal door, the stacked boxes. Everything exactly the same as it looked when I walked back there earlier. I rewound the footage again. 11:33 p.m. Nothing. 11:34 p.m. The handle moved, just slightly. Then again, slow, careful, like someone testing it from the other side. I watched it 3 times. Each time my chest felt a little tighter, because there was no mistake. Someone had been at that door. I checked the timestamp again, 11:34 p.m. But the man had been standing at the counter around that time, talking to me, drinking coffee, asking about my schedule. I remembered the way he leaned forward when he spoke, the way he watched my face, the calm voice, the slight smile. He had been right there, inside the store. So who tried the door? I felt a chill crawl up the back of my neck. The store suddenly felt much bigger and much emptier. I glanced toward the hallway again, still dark, still quiet. The monitor hummed softly under the counter. I switched the camera view to the parking lot. Nothing. Empty pumps, yellow lights glowing over the asphalt. The highway beyond the station was completely dark. No headlights, no cars, no trucks. I switched back to the hallway feed. The door hadn't moved again, but something about the footage made me uneasy. I leaned closer, trying to focus on every detail. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The hallway light. It was off. I frowned, because I knew that couldn't be right. When I checked the door earlier tonight, the hallway light had been on. I remembered it clearly. I had turned it off before walking back to the counter, but in the camera footage, at 11:34 p.m., the hallway light was already off, which meant something impossible. The door handle moved, after I had already left the hallway, and after the light was turned off. I sat back slowly. The quiet inside the store suddenly felt heavier, like the air had thickened around me. My eyes drifted back to the monitor again. The hallway camera still showed nothing, but now I couldn't stop thinking about the timing. 11:30, I locked the door. 11:34, someone tried the handle. And during that exact moment, I had been standing at the counter, talking to a man who already knew my schedule. I looked toward the front windows again. The parking lot was still empty, but the feeling in my chest had changed. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was the quiet realization that something about this night didn't make sense, and whatever had tested that door had known exactly when I would be inside the store. I sat there for a long time staring at the monitor. The hallway camera showed nothing. The metal door, the stacked boxes, the quiet yellow light from the store spilling faintly into the corridor. Nothing moved, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. That small moment on the footage kept repeating in my mind, the handle moving, slowly, carefully, like someone on the other side knew exactly how much pressure to use. Just enough to test the lock, not enough to make noise. I rubbed my eyes and leaned closer to the screen again. Maybe I missed something. Maybe someone had walked through the alley. Maybe the wind moved the handle. I rewound the footage again. 11:33 p.m. Nothing. 11:34 p.m. The handle shifted. Just slightly. Then again, the bolt held, and whoever was there stopped. I watched the rest of the footage. Nothing else happened. The hallway stayed empty. I switched the monitor back to the front camera. The store looked exactly like it did right now. Fluorescent lights, empty aisles, the counter. Me standing there earlier talking to the man with the coffee. I watched the moment he entered again. The bell above the door rang. He walked inside, calm, unhurried, like someone who had been there before. I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to earlier. When the door opened, he didn't look around the store. Most customers do. They glance at the coolers, the snack shelves, the register. He didn't. He looked straight at me, like he already knew exactly where I would be standing. I watched the footage again, and then something else bothered me. I checked the timestamp, 11:31 p.m. That was when he entered the store. But something about that moment felt wrong. So I rewound the video further, back to 11:29. The door was closed, the store empty. Then the timestamp rolled forward, 11:30, and something moved outside the door, not clearly, just a shadow passing across the glass. Then the door opened, the bell rang, and the man walked in. I froze, because the movement outside the door had happened before the door opened, which meant the person standing there had been looking inside first, watching. I leaned closer to the monitor again. The reflection in the glass door made it hard to see clearly, but the shape outside the door was tall, still, waiting. Then the door opened. The man stepped inside. I paused the footage. The image froze on the screen. For a second, the only sound in the store was the low hum of the refrigerators. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The reflection in the glass door. Right before the man walked in, there were two shadows outside, one standing in front of the door, and another shape further back, near the side of the building, near the alley, near the back hallway door. I felt the air leave my lungs slowly. The man inside the store had been talking to me the entire time. Calm, friendly, asking about my schedule. But outside, someone else had been standing behind the building, testing the door, and whoever it was had known exactly when to try it. The motel sat just off Interstate 40. One of those places travelers only notice when they're tired enough to stop. Faded sign. 8 rooms in a straight row. A small lobby with a vending machine that hummed louder than the air conditioner. I worked the night desk. 11 at night until 7 in the morning. Most of the job was simple. Hand out keys, answer the phone, try not to fall asleep around 3 in the morning when the road outside went completely quiet. The motel mostly got truck drivers and people driving cross-country. Occasionally, couples who didn't want to pay for a nicer place closer to town. That night had been unusually slow. By 1:30 a.m., I hadn't checked in a single guest. The lobby lights buzzed softly above me while I flipped through an old magazine someone had left on the counter. Outside the glass door, the parking lot was empty. Just yellow security lights and a line of dark rooms stretching along the side of the building. Room numbers painted on metal doors, most of them unused that week. I remember glancing at the clock on the wall. 1:41 a.m. That was when headlights turned into the driveway. An older sedan, dark color, could have been black or dark blue. The car rolled slowly across the parking lot before stopping in front of the lobby. For a moment, the headlights shined directly through the glass doors. Then the engine shut off. The driver stepped out. A man, mid-40s maybe, plain clothes, nothing strange about him. He walked across the lot at an easy pace and pushed the lobby door open. The bell above the frame rang once. "Evening," he said. His voice was calm, friendly, the kind of voice you hear from people who have spent a lot of time traveling alone. "Evening," I said. He stepped up to the counter and looked around the small lobby for a moment, not suspiciously, just observing, like most first-time guests do. "You got any rooms available tonight?" "Yeah," I said. "Plenty." He nodded slightly. "Just need one for the night." I slid the registration sheet across the counter. "ID and a card if you have one." He reached into his wallet and handed me his driver's license. Then he rested his elbows lightly on the counter while I typed his information into the motel computer. The system we used was old, older than the computer itself. Green text, black screen, slow. It took a second for the guest profile to load. Then the computer made a short beep. A small message appeared in the corner of the screen. "ID already used this week." I frowned slightly. Probably a system glitch. The motel software did that sometimes. I glanced back up at him. "Have you stayed here recently?" The man tilted his head slightly. "Not that I remember." He didn't sound defensive. He didn't sound confused either. Just certain. I looked back at the screen. The message was still there. "ID already used this week," which was strange, because I had been working every night that week, and I was pretty sure I had never seen this man before. I looked back at the screen for a second. The message was still there. I had already used this week. Sometimes the system did strange things. The computer at the motel had probably been installed sometime in the early 2000s. Green text, black screen, slow processor. Half the time it froze if you clicked too quickly. I cleared the search and typed his name again. Same result. The small warning line appeared again in the corner. I'd already used this week. I glanced back up at the man. He was standing calmly at the counter, looking around the lobby. His eyes moved slowly from the vending machine to the hallway that led toward the rooms, then back to the counter. He didn't look nervous. If anything, he looked patient, like someone used to waiting in places like this. "You sure you haven't stayed here this week?" I asked. He shook his head lightly. "No." Then he added after a moment, I've been driving most of the last few days. His tone was relaxed. Nothing defensive, nothing suspicious, just a tired traveler answering a question. I looked back at the computer again. The system had opened a small guest history window. It showed a record from 3 nights earlier. Same name, same ID number. Check-in time, 1:18 a.m. Room number, 12. I felt a small pause in my chest, because I remembered that night. I had worked that shift too, and I didn't remember checking in anyone at 1:18. In fact, I was pretty sure that had been a completely empty night. I closed the guest history window. Maybe housekeeping had entered something wrong. Maybe the system had duplicated an old record. It wouldn't be the first time. System might be glitching, I said casually. The man gave a small nod. That happens. I opened a new reservation line. Just one night? Yes. I looked at the room list. Most of the motel was empty. Rooms 2 through 8 were available. Room 10 was clean. Room 11 needed maintenance. Room 12. I paused for a second. Room 12 was technically available, but for some reason the number from the guest history stayed in my mind. Check-in. Room 12. 3 nights ago. I hovered the mouse over the room list. Then the man spoke again. Is room 12 open tonight? I looked up at him. Why that one? He shrugged slightly. End rooms are quieter. That was true. Room 12 sat at the far end of the building, closest to the desert behind the motel. Most guests preferred it because there was less traffic outside the door. Still, something about the coincidence made me hesitate. You've stayed in that room before? I asked. The man smiled faintly. Maybe. It was such a simple answer, but the way he said it made the room feel just a little smaller. I looked back at the screen again. Room 12 was still marked clean, available. I clicked the room assignment and printed the key card. The machine hummed softly as the card slid out. I placed it on the counter. Room 12, I said. The man picked up the key card and glanced toward the door. Then he looked back at me. Quiet night tonight? Usually is, I said. He nodded slowly. Good. Then he turned and walked out into the parking lot. Through the glass doors, I watched him cross the pavement under the yellow lights. He didn't go straight to the row of rooms. Instead, he stopped for a moment in the middle of the lot, standing still, looking toward the end of the building, toward room 12. Then he started walking again, and for some reason I couldn't explain, I felt like the motel had just become a little less empty. The parking lot was quiet again after the man disappeared around the corner of the building. I watched the camera monitor for a few seconds. Room 12 sat at the far end of the row. The camera angle barely reached that corner, but I could still see the light outside the door turn on as he walked past. Then the hallway went still again. I leaned back in the chair behind the desk. Night shifts always stretch time in strange ways. 10 minutes could feel like an hour, and the quiet made every small detail seem bigger than it really was. Still, the message on the computer screen kept bothering me. ID already used this week. I told myself it was probably nothing, but curiosity is dangerous when you're working alone at night. Eventually, I opened the guest history again. Same record. 3 nights ago. Check-in, 1:18 a.m. Room, 12. No checkout time listed. That part caught my attention. Most guests checked out before noon. Housekeeping updated the system right after cleaning the room, but this record had no checkout, just the original check-in entry, which meant one of two things. Either someone forgot to close the reservation, or the system believed the guest had never left. I clicked through the rest of the log. The screen showed the room status, room 12, clean, available, which contradicted the record directly. If the guest had never checked out, the room shouldn't have been marked available. I sat there staring at the screen for a while. The motel computer hummed quietly under the desk. Outside, the highway was completely silent now. Around 2 in the morning, traffic usually died off. That left the building sitting alone beside the dark desert. Eventually, I switched the monitor to the exterior cameras. Camera 1, parking lot, empty. Camera 2, ice machine area, nothing moving. Camera 3, hallway facing the rooms. The view stopped just short of room 12, but I could see part of the walkway and the yellow light shining against the wall. For a long time, nothing happened. Then something moved. A shadow crossed the edge of the camera frame, just briefly, like someone stepping out of a doorway. I leaned forward, waiting. A second later, the man appeared. He walked into the camera view slowly, looking down the hallway toward the lobby, not toward the parking lot, toward me. Even though there was no way he could actually see me from that distance. He stood there for a moment, perfectly still. Then he looked toward the door of room 12 and knocked. 3 quiet knocks. I frowned, because I had just checked him into that room, and he already had the key. I stared at the monitor for a second longer than I meant to. The man stood outside room 12, waiting. The hallway light above the door cast a pale yellow circle across the concrete walkway. His shadow stretched across the wall beside him. Then the door opened. Slowly, just a few inches at first. From the camera angle I couldn't see inside the room. Only darkness. The man didn't step back. He didn't look surprised either. If anything, he looked like he had been expecting it. The door opened wider. Someone inside the room spoke. I couldn't hear the words. The hallway camera didn't record sound. But I could see the man nod slightly, like he was answering a question. Then he stepped forward and disappeared inside the room. The door closed behind him. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. That didn't make sense. Not at all. I had just checked him into that room. He had the key, which meant the room should have been empty before he got there. But someone had opened the door from inside. I switched back to the guest log on the computer. Room 12. 1 guest. Check-in, 1:41 a.m. Status, occupied. Nothing else. No second name, no extra reservation. I checked the room list again. Every other room in the motel was empty. Just 1 guest in the building. Room 12. I felt a quiet tension settle in my chest. Maybe the camera angle fooled me. Maybe the door had swung open because it wasn't shut properly. Maybe the man had pushed it himself. But the more I replayed the footage in my head, the less that explanation made sense. The door had opened before he touched it. I switched back to the hallway camera again. The walkway was empty now. The door of room 12 was closed. The light above it buzzed softly. Nothing moved. For a long time I just sat there watching. Night shifts have a strange way of stretching silence. The building felt different now, like the motel itself was holding its breath. Finally, curiosity got the better of me again. I rewound the camera footage, back to the moment he knocked. 3 quiet knocks. Then the door opening. I paused the frame right before the door moved. The man stood there, looking straight ahead, waiting. I zoomed the image slightly. The camera quality was terrible, grainy, faded, but I could still make out something strange. His hand. He wasn't holding the key card anymore. It was still in his pocket, which meant something else. When the door opened, it definitely wasn't him unlocking it. For a while I just sat there watching the monitor. The hallway camera showed nothing. The door of room 12 stayed closed. The yellow light above it buzzed softly, casting a dull circle over the concrete walkway. Everything looked normal again. But the moment I had just watched didn't feel normal. Someone had opened that door from inside. I leaned back in the chair and tried to think through it logically. Maybe the door hadn't closed properly earlier. Maybe housekeeping had left it unlocked. Maybe the wind pushed it open. Those explanations sounded reasonable for about 5 seconds. Then I remembered the knock. 3 slow knocks. And the way the man had waited, like he expected someone to answer. I switched the camera feed again. The hallway stayed empty. Room 12 didn't move. Finally, I opened the motel computer again. The green text flickered across the screen. Room status window. Room 12. Occupied. Guest name. The same name from the ID he had just given me. Check-in time. 1:41 a.m. I scrolled down to the reservation history. The older entry appeared again, 3 nights earlier. Same ID, same name. Room 12. No checkout, just an open record sitting in the system, which meant something strange. Technically, the room had been occupied for 3 days already. I rubbed my forehead and leaned closer to the screen. Maybe someone forgot to clear the room. Maybe the software copied the entry. But something else caught my attention. The timestamp on the older record. 1:18 a.m. 3 nights ago. Almost the same time he arrived tonight. That detail made the back of my neck feel cold. I switched the camera monitor again. The hallway camera showed the same quiet scene. Then suddenly, the door of room 12 opened. Just a few inches. A thin slice of darkness appeared in the doorway. I sat forward in the chair, waiting. The door opened a little wider, but nobody stepped out. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then I saw a hand reach out. Not the man's hand, someone else's. The hand rested against the edge of the door, and slowly pulled it closed again. The hallway went still. The door clicked shut. I stared at the screen for a long time, because there was only one guest registered in the motel, room 12, and whoever had just closed that door was definitely not the man I had checked in. I kept staring at the monitor. The hallway outside room 12 was quiet again. The door was closed. The yellow light above it buzzed faintly, the same way it had been buzzing all night. For a moment I wondered if I had imagined the hand. Maybe the camera glitch had created a shadow. Maybe my eyes were tired. Night shifts do strange things to your brain after 2 in the morning. Still, I rewound the footage. The timeline slid backward across the screen. The door opening, the dark gap in the doorway, and then the hand, slow, calm, pulling the door shut again from the inside. There was no mistake. Someone else was in that room. I leaned back slowly. The motel suddenly felt much smaller than it had earlier that night. Just 8 rooms, 1 narrow hallway, 1 empty parking lot, and me alone behind the desk. I switched to the parking lot camera. Nothing. The sedan was still parked near the edge of the lot. No movement. No headlights on the highway. Then the desk phone rang. The sound made me jump. It echoed through the empty lobby. I picked up the receiver. Front desk. Silence for a second. Then the same calm voice from earlier. The man from room 12. "Hey," he said. "Yeah? I think there might be someone in my room." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean?" "I heard someone walking in the bathroom," he said quietly. "I thought maybe housekeeping came in earlier, but the door was locked." I looked at the monitor again. The hallway camera still showed the closed door. "You're the only guest checked in tonight," I said. There was a pause on the line. Then he spoke again. "That's what I thought." His voice stayed calm, too calm, like he wasn't surprised. I watched the door on the monitor. Nothing moved. "Do you want me to come take a look?" I asked. Another pause. Then he said something that made the room feel colder. "No." "Why not?" "Because if someone is in here," he said slowly, "they were already here before I arrived." The line went quiet again. Then he added one more thing. "And judging by the smell in this room, I don't think they ever left." The warehouse sat about 20 minutes outside Oklahoma City. Not the kind of place people notice during the day. Just a long metal building beside a service road, surrounded by chain-link fence and empty fields. At night it felt even more isolated, especially on the late shift. I worked as the night dock supervisor, 10 at night until 6 in the morning. Most nights the job was simple. Check incoming trucks, verify the bill of lading, assign a dock door, then wait while the forklift guys unloaded the trailers. After 2 in the morning things usually slowed down. Most scheduled deliveries had already come through. The yard lights cast a pale yellow glow across the asphalt outside the loading bays. Beyond the fence there was nothing but dark highway and open land. Inside the office, the only sounds were the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional crackle from the dispatch radio. That night had been especially quiet. Just me, one forklift operator named Luis, and a security guard in the small booth by the front gate. Around 2:10 a.m., I was sitting at the desk updating the delivery log when I saw headlights sweep across the yard cameras. A semi-truck was pulling through the gate. That caught my attention immediately, because according to the dispatch board, we weren't expecting another truck until nearly 4 in the morning. I switched the monitor to the yard camera. The truck rolled slowly across the asphalt and stopped near dock lane 3. White tractor, plain trailer, no company logo. That was unusual. Most freight companies kept their branding everywhere. I grabbed the clipboard with the delivery schedule and checked it again. Nothing matched the trailer number I could see on the camera. After a minute, the driver climbed down from the cab. He walked across the yard toward the office door. Tall guy, maybe mid-40s, work jacket, baseball cap pulled low. Nothing about him seemed strange at first glance. He opened the office door and stepped inside. The cold air from outside followed him in. "Evening," he said. His voice sounded calm, almost casual. "Evening," I replied. "You guys expecting a delivery?" he asked. "Depends who it's from," I said. He shook his head lightly. "That's the problem." He pulled a folded set of shipping papers from his jacket and placed them on the desk. "I think dispatch sent me to the wrong warehouse." That kind of thing happened more often than people realized. Bad GPS, wrong address, drivers getting redirected at the last minute. I picked up the paperwork and glanced through it. The company name looked legitimate, so did the freight description, but the delivery address listed on the form definitely wasn't ours. "You coming from Texas?" I asked. "Yeah." "Long drive?" He nodded. "Long night." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The warehouse behind the office was silent. No forklifts running, no trailers unloading, just the low mechanical hum of the building. Then the driver glanced toward the yard through the window. "You mind if I park here for a bit while I call dispatch?" he asked. "That's fine," I said. "Just stay clear of the loading lanes." He nodded once. "Appreciated." Then he turned and walked back across the yard toward his truck. I watched him on the security monitor as he climbed back into the cab. The engine stayed off. The truck just sat there under the floodlights. At the time, it didn't seem like anything unusual. It was just another driver trying to figure out where he was supposed to go. But a few minutes later, Luis walked into the office from the warehouse floor, and the first thing he said made me look back at the cameras again. "Hey," he said slowly, "that trailer out there." "Yeah? I swear I've seen that truck here before." Luis stood beside the desk looking at the monitor. "You mean that truck?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, lane 3. I switched the screen back to the yard camera. The semi was still sitting under the floodlights. Engine off, cab dark. The long white trailer stretched across the asphalt like a shadow. "You sure?" I asked. Luis shrugged. "I think so." That wasn't unusual by itself. Truck drivers often ran the same routes over and over again. If someone had delivered here before, it made sense that one of the forklift guys might remember the trailer. Still, something about the way Luis said it made me curious. "You remember when?" I asked. Luis leaned closer to the monitor. "Couple nights ago, maybe." He squinted at the screen. "Same trailer number." I looked at the numbers printed along the side of the trailer. Hard to read from the camera angle, but I could make out most of it. TXL 44817. I opened the delivery log on the computer. Every truck that entered the yard was supposed to be recorded. Time, trailer number, company, dock door. I scrolled back through the past few days. Monday night, nothing. Tuesday, normal shipments. Wednesday, still nothing matching that trailer number. Luis frowned. "Maybe I'm wrong." "Maybe," I said, but something about it still bothered me. So I opened the camera archive. The system kept the last week of security footage. I selected the yard camera and started scrolling backward through the timeline. Earlier tonight, empty yard. Then midnight, still empty. I kept going. Eventually the timestamp reached 2 nights earlier. The same floodlights, the same empty yard. For a long time, nothing moved. Then headlights appeared at the gate. A truck. I leaned closer. The trailer rolled slowly across the camera view. White trailer, plain sides, and the number along the back. TXL 44817. Luis pointed at the screen. "That's it." The truck stopped just outside the gate, but something strange happened next. It never entered the yard. The truck just sat there, parked in the darkness beyond the fence. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the screen. 2 minutes passed, 5 minutes, 10. The truck never moved. Finally, the headlights turned slightly. The engine started again, and the truck drove away down the highway. Luis leaned back. "That's weird." I nodded. "Yeah. Because if the truck had never entered the yard, there should have been no reason for the driver to be here tonight. Yet outside the office window, that exact same trailer was sitting in dock lane 3. Luis kept staring at the monitor for a moment. "That's the same truck," he said again quietly. I nodded. The footage from 2 nights ago was clear enough to recognize the trailer number, TXL 44817, and now that exact trailer was sitting in our yard. I switched the screen back to the live camera. The truck hadn't moved, still parked in lane 3. Floodlights reflected off the white trailer walls. The cab sat in shadow. "You said it stayed outside the gate that night?" Luis asked. "Yeah." "For how long?" I glanced back at the archived footage. "About 10 minutes. Luis scratched his beard. "That's strange. Truck drivers get lost all the time," I said. Maybe he realized this wasn't the right place and left. Luis didn't answer. He just kept watching the monitor. After a moment, he pointed at the screen. "You see that?" I leaned forward. Inside the cab of the truck, a faint light flickered. Probably the dashboard. The driver was still inside, just sitting there. "Maybe he's calling dispatch," I said. Luis shook his head slowly. "He's been sitting like that since he came in." I frowned. "How long?" Luis checked the clock on the wall. "Almost 40 minutes. That made me look back at the monitor again. The truck hadn't moved. No headlights, no door opening, just the cab sitting under the lights. From the camera angle, I could barely see through the windshield, but I could make out the silhouette of the driver, hands on the steering wheel, head facing forward, looking toward the office window. Luis shifted uncomfortably. "You think that's weird?" "A little," I admitted. Truck drivers usually didn't sit that still. Most of them stepped out, stretched their legs, walked around the trailer, used the restroom. This guy hadn't done any of that. He had climbed back into the truck and stayed there, watching the building. I switched the camera angle to the gate cam. Nothing on the road. The highway beyond the warehouse was completely dark. Then the radio on the desk crackled. The security guard's voice came through. "You got a truck in the yard?" "Yeah," I said. "White trailer." There was a pause. "Did he check in with you?" "Yeah, wrong address delivery." Another pause. Then the guard said something that made Luis and I look at each other. "That's strange." "Why?" I asked. "Because that truck," the radio crackled again. "I watched it pull in, and the driver never got out." Luis and I both looked at the radio for a second. "What do you mean he never got out?" I asked. The security guard answered immediately. "I've been watching the gate camera since he pulled in," he said. "Driver stayed in the truck the whole time." Luis frowned. "That's not possible." I glanced back at the yard camera. The semi was still parked in lane 3, exactly where it had been since it arrived. Cab dark, trailer still, the silhouette of the driver visible through the windshield. I leaned closer to the monitor. From this distance, it looked like someone was sitting behind the wheel, head forward, hands near the steering wheel, just barely visible through the reflection of the floodlights. "You sure you didn't miss him walking across the yard?" I asked into the radio. "No," the guard said. "Gate cam sees the whole driveway." Luis crossed his arms. "But he was just inside the office," he said quietly. Both of us knew that. The man had stood right here at the desk, handed over paperwork, talked about dispatch, then walked back outside. I had watched him cross the yard, so had Luis. Yet the security guard sounded completely certain. "That truck pulled in," the guard said, "and the driver never stepped out." The radio went silent again. Luis slowly turned back toward the monitor. "You think the guard's messing with us?" he asked. "I don't think so," I said. The guard had been working nights here for years. He wasn't the type to joke about things over the radio, especially this late. I zoomed the camera view slightly. The grainy image sharpened just enough to see the cab more clearly. For a second, it still looked like someone was sitting there. Then the floodlight shifted as a moth passed in front of the camera. The reflection changed, and the shape inside the cab disappeared. Luis leaned forward. "Wait," I zoomed the image again. The driver's seat was empty, no silhouette, no movement, just the steering wheel and the dark interior of the cab. I felt a slow chill move through my chest, because if the seat was empty now, then someone had to have gotten out of that truck, and if the security guard was right, they never walked through the gate, which meant there was only one other place they could be. Luis looked toward the warehouse floor behind us. Rows of tall pallet racks stretched into the darkness of the building. Most of the lights in the back were off. Only the loading area near the docks was illuminated. The rest of the warehouse was a maze of shadows and stacked freight. Luis lowered his voice. "You think he came inside?" Before I could answer, something heavy shifted somewhere deep in the warehouse. A dull metallic sound, like a pallet being dragged across concrete. Luis and I both froze. The noise came again, farther inside the building this time. And suddenly the empty truck outside the office window felt like the least worrying thing in the yard. Luis and I stood there listening. The warehouse was quiet again, too quiet. The metal racks inside the building rose 3 levels high, packed with pallets and boxed freight. At night, the place always felt bigger than it did during the day. Empty space, concrete floors, long rows of shadows. Luis swallowed. You heard that too, right? Yeah, I said. The sound had definitely come from inside the warehouse. Something heavy, metal against concrete, not something that happened by itself. Luis looked toward the dark aisles behind the loading docks. Maybe something fell. Maybe. But neither of us moved. Because if something had fallen, someone should have been there to knock it over. And right now, the only people scheduled in the building were me and Luis. The radio on the desk crackled again. You guys still there? The security guard asked. Yeah, I said. You still see the truck? I glanced back at the monitor. The trailer hadn't moved. Still sitting under the yard lights. Truck's still here, I said. Another pause on the radio. Then the guard spoke again, slower this time. You might want to come look at something. What? The dispatch board. That confused me. The dispatch board? Yeah, he said. I just checked the incoming routes for tonight. Luis and I exchanged a glance. What about it? I asked. There was a short silence on the radio before the guard answered. That truck number you gave me. TXL 44817. Yeah, he inhaled slowly. It's not scheduled anywhere. What do you mean? I mean, it doesn't exist in the system. Luis frowned. Maybe wrong company? That's what I thought, the guard said. So I checked the National Freight Registry. Another pause. Then he finished the sentence quietly. That trailer number hasn't been active for 3 years. A cold feeling moved through my chest. I turned slowly toward the office window. The floodlights outside cast long reflections across the glass. The white trailer was still there, perfectly still. Luis stepped closer to the monitor again. You sure you read it right? He asked. Yeah, the guard replied. And there's something else. What? That trailer number. The guard's voice lowered slightly. It was reported stolen. When? 3 years ago. Luis stared at the screen. From where? The answer came through the radio a moment later. About 20 miles from your warehouse. The office went silent. I looked back through the window again. The truck sat exactly where it had been all night. Engine off, cab dark, empty. Then suddenly, the trailer lights flickered once. Luis leaned forward. Did you see that? Before I could answer, the truck engine roared to life. The cab headlights snapped on, and the semi slowly began rolling forward across the yard, straight toward the exit gate. Luis rushed to the door and pushed it open. The cold night air rushed into the office. We watched the truck pass under the floodlights. But as it moved by the building, the driver's seat inside the cab was still empty. Luis and I stood in the doorway watching the truck move across the yard. The engine noise echoed off the metal warehouse walls. Headlights cut through the thin fog that had started drifting in from the highway. Neither of us spoke. The semi rolled slowly past dock lane 2, then lane 1. The cab passed directly under the floodlight beside the office. For a moment, the inside of the truck became clearly visible. Empty. The driver's seat was completely empty. No movement. No hands on the wheel. Yet the steering wheel turned slightly as the truck adjusted its path toward the exit. Luis whispered under his breath, "There's nobody driving that." I didn't answer, because I was staring at the same thing. The radio crackled. The security guard's voice came through. "Truck's heading toward the gate." "Yeah," I said quietly. "You see the driver?" There was a short pause. Then the guard replied, "No." Another pause. I didn't see anyone in that cab when it came in either. The truck reached the gate. The metal barrier lifted slowly. The headlights swept across the road outside. Then the semi rolled forward and disappeared onto the dark highway. Just like that. The yard went silent again. Luis exhaled slowly. What the hell was that? Before I could answer, a loud metallic crash echoed from deep inside the warehouse. Both of us turned instantly. The sound had come from somewhere far down aisle 7. Luis grabbed the flashlight hanging beside the door. "You heard that?" "Yeah." We stepped into the warehouse together. The air inside felt colder than before. Rows of tall pallet racks stretched into darkness. Our footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. Luis pointed the flashlight down the aisle. A pallet had fallen partially off the rack. Boxes were tilted sideways. Something heavy had definitely been moved. But what caught my attention was the dust on the floor. A long drag mark cut across the concrete, like something had been pulled through the aisle. Luis crouched down beside it. "You see footprints?" I shook my head. There were none. Just the drag mark. Nothing else. We followed it halfway down the aisle before it faded into the darker part of the warehouse. Luis looked around nervously. "You think someone's still in here?" I suddenly remembered something. "The cameras," I said. We hurried back to the office. I opened the security playback from earlier. The timestamp showed the moment the truck driver had supposedly walked into the office. Luis leaned over my shoulder as the footage played. The office door opened. Cold air blew in, but no one stepped inside. The camera showed me standing at the desk, talking, nodding, looking at paperwork, but there was no one standing across from me. Luis slowly leaned back from the screen. "You were talking to yourself." I stared at the footage. My voice could even be heard faintly through the camera microphone, answering questions, pausing, listening. But the space in front of the desk was empty. Outside the office window, the yard lights flickered slightly in the wind. The highway beyond the fence was completely dark again. The truck was gone. Luis turned toward the window. "You think that thing came from the truck?" I didn't answer, because at that moment the radio crackled one more time. The security guard's voice sounded uneasy. "You guys should see this." "What?" "I just replayed the gate camera." Luis and I both looked at the monitor. The footage showed the truck leaving the yard. Trailer number TXL44817 clearly visible. As the cab passed the camera, something shifted inside the passenger seat. Just for a second, a shape, like someone leaning forward. But it wasn't the man who had come into the office, and it definitely wasn't human. The guard spoke quietly over the radio. "That truck wasn't empty." Always felt different after midnight. During the day, the place was loud, phones ringing, visitors talking in the hallways, monitors beeping constantly. But once the night shift settled in, everything slowed down. Lights dimmed, voices lowered, even the air felt quieter. I had been working the medical floor night shift for almost 4 years, so the silence never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it. Less chaos, less people, just routine. Check vitals, update charts, answer the occasional call light. That night started like most others. My shift began at 11. By 1 in the morning, most of the patients were asleep. The hallway lights were dimmed to their night setting, leaving long, soft reflections across the polished floor. Only a few sounds broke the silence. A monitor alarm from room 214, the hum of the medication fridge behind the nurse station, and the distant squeak of a supply cart somewhere down the hall. I sat at the computer finishing chart notes when the elevator at the end of the corridor dinged. That wasn't unusual. Doctors sometimes came up from the ER. Lab techs moved between floors. Still, I glanced down the hallway out of habit. A woman stepped out of the elevator. Blue scrubs, dark hair tied back. She walked calmly toward the nurse station, like she had been there 100 times before. When she got closer, she smiled. "You must be covering tonight," she said. Her voice was soft but confident. I nodded. "Yeah, just me and a CNA until morning." She rested her elbow lightly on the counter. "You've been doing doubles this week, right?" That caught my attention. Not many people knew my schedule unless they worked on the floor. "Yeah," I said slowly. "How'd you know that?" She shrugged slightly. "Word gets around." For a moment she looked down the quiet hallway behind me. Most of the patient room doors were closed. The monitors glowed faintly through the glass windows beside each door. Then she looked back at me. "You look exhausted," she said. That part was true. I had picked up 2 extra shifts that week. Sleep had been more of a suggestion than a guarantee. Before I could respond, she reached up and adjusted the badge clipped to her chest. The plastic flipped briefly, but the name side never quite faced me. "I'm Angela," she said. "Float nurse." I frowned slightly. We had float nurses sometimes, but usually the charge nurse mentioned them during shift report. No one had said anything earlier. "You covering a unit tonight?" I asked. "Something like that," she replied. Then she glanced at the patient board beside the desk. "Looks like you've got a light load." "Quiet night so far," I said. Angela nodded thoughtfully. "Well," she said, "if you want, I could take the rest of your shift." I blinked. "What?" "You've been pulling doubles," she said. I can cover the floor until morning. You go home, get some sleep. For a moment, I just stared at her. Night nurses helped each other sometimes. People swapped hours or covered emergencies, but usually those things were arranged ahead of time, not randomly at 2 in the morning. You sure? I asked. Angela smiled again, a calm, reassuring smile. I'm already here, she said. And trust me, you shouldn't still be here tonight. Angela stayed behind the nurse station while I finished updating the chart notes. She didn't rush, didn't seem impatient. She just stood there quietly watching the hallway, like she was already part of the floor. After a minute, she walked over to the patient board mounted on the wall. Room numbers, patient initials, medication reminders, normal stuff. She studied it for a moment. Then she said something that made me look up. Room 214 tends to hit the call light a lot. I blinked. How do you know that? Angela pointed down the hallway. Older man, heart monitor, gets nervous when it's quiet. That was accurate. Very accurate. Room 214 had been hitting the call button every 20 minutes since midnight. But I hadn't told her that, and the patient had only been admitted earlier that evening. You floated here before? I asked. Angela shook her head. No, she said it casually, like the answer didn't matter. Then she walked down the hallway, just like someone starting a normal shift. I watched her go. Her steps were quiet on the polished floor. She stopped outside room 212, glanced inside through the small glass window, then continued toward 214. A second later, the call light for 214 went off. She had answered it. I sat back in my chair. That part actually felt reassuring. If she really was helping cover the floor, maybe I could finally catch a break tonight. A few minutes later, Angela returned to the nurse station. He just needed reassurance, she said. He thought the monitor alarm was malfunctioning. Thanks, I replied. She nodded. Then she looked at the computer terminal. You chart everything through this system? Yeah, I said. Log in through the badge scanner. Angela leaned slightly toward the screen. For a moment, I thought she was going to sign in, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped back. I'll let you handle the documentation, she said. That seemed odd. Even float nurses had to chart patient interactions. Still, maybe she was just trying to make things easier for me. I continued typing while Angela walked to the medication cabinet. She opened the drawer, looked inside, then closed it again. You keep emergency meds in the lower compartment, right? She asked. I paused. Yeah. How'd you know that? Angela shrugged again. Most hospitals organize them that way. Maybe. But something about the way she moved around the station felt familiar. Too familiar. Like someone who had worked here for years. After a while, the CNA came down the hallway, pushing a supply cart. She stopped when she saw Angela standing beside the counter. Oh, she said. I didn't know we had another nurse tonight. Angela smiled politely. Just helping out. The CNA nodded slowly and continued down the hall. But before she turned the corner, she glanced back at me. Her expression looked confused. Once she disappeared, Angela leaned against the counter again. You should really go home, she said quietly. You've done enough for tonight. I hesitated. Leaving early during a quiet shift did sound tempting, but something still bothered me. So I reached for the schedule binder under the desk, just to double-check who was assigned overnight. I flipped through the pages until I found the staff roster. Names, departments, shift assignments. I scanned the list once, then again. Angela's name wasn't there. I kept staring at the schedule binder for a few seconds. Angela's name wasn't anywhere on the page. Not under night shift, not under float staff, not even under on-call coverage. For a moment I wondered if I had simply missed it. So I flipped back a page, then another. Still nothing. Behind me I heard Angela moving quietly around the nurse station, opening drawers, closing them again, like she was organizing things. You find what you're looking for? She asked calmly. I turned the binder toward her. I was just checking the roster, I said. Angela tilted her head slightly. Everything look right? Yeah, I said. But my voice sounded less certain than I expected. Angela smiled again. The same calm expression she had been wearing since she arrived. You work too hard, she said softly. You shouldn't still be here tonight. Before I could respond, the call light for room 217 turned on. Angela glanced toward the hallway. I'll get that, she said. She walked away before I could stop her. I watched her move down the corridor. Her steps were slow, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world. The door to room 217 opened, then closed behind her. I sat there for a moment trying to shake the uneasy feeling building in my chest. Maybe the schedule binder was outdated. Maybe Angela had been sent up from another floor. Hospitals changed assignments all the time. Still, I picked up the phone at the desk and dialed the operator. The call connected after 2 rings. Hospital switchboard. "Hey," I said. "This is the medical floor. Quick question." "Go ahead. Do we have a float nurse named Angela covering tonight?" There was a brief pause on the line. "I can check," the operator said. I heard typing, more typing. Then the operator spoke again. "We don't have anyone by that name scheduled tonight. What about agency staff?" "Nothing listed." I felt the uneasy feeling in my stomach grow heavier. "You sure?" "Yes." "Okay, thanks." I hung up slowly. At that moment, the CNA returned from the supply room pushing her cart. She stopped beside the desk. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Quick question, though." "What?" "The nurse that's helping tonight, Angela." The CNA frowned slightly. "Angela?" "Yeah, the one who just went into room 217. The CNA glanced down the hallway. The door to 217 was still closed. Then she looked back at me. "There's nobody else on the floor tonight." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's just you and me," she said. She leaned closer to the desk. "I thought she was your friend visiting or something." Before I could answer, the heart monitor alarm in room 217 suddenly started screaming. The alarm from room 217 cut through the quiet floor like a siren. A sharp, continuous tone, the kind that made every nurse's stomach drop instantly. I pushed my chair back and ran down the hallway. The CNA followed close behind. When I reached the door to 217, it was already partially open. The heart monitor inside the room was screaming, heart rate dropping, blood pressure warning flashing red. Angela was standing beside the patient's bed. She had already pulled open the medication tray. A syringe rested in her hand. For half a second, my brain tried to catch up with what I was seeing. "How long has he been unstable?" I asked. Angela didn't answer right away. She looked strangely calm, almost detached. "I'm stabilizing him," she said quietly. Something about the way she said it made me step closer. The medication vial beside the tray caught my eye. My stomach tightened immediately. "That's not right," I said. Angela looked up at me slowly. "What?" "That's the wrong medication." The vial in her hand wasn't a stabilizer. It was a powerful sedative, the kind that could drop blood pressure even further. If she injected it now, the patient's condition could crash completely. Angela stared at the syringe, then back at me. For a moment, her expression didn't change, like she was considering something. "You shouldn't still be here tonight," she said again. The exact same sentence, the exact same calm tone. I stepped forward and took the syringe from her hand. "We'll handle it," I said firmly. The CNA moved quickly to adjust the oxygen line. I reached for the correct medication in the cabinet and began preparing it. Angela didn't argue. She simply stepped back from the bed. The monitor continued beeping while we worked. After a few tense seconds, the patient's heart rate stabilized. The alarm quieted. The room finally fell silent again. I exhaled slowly. When I looked up again, Angela was gone. The door to the room stood open. The hallway outside was empty. I stepped into the corridor. "Angela?" No answer. The lights hummed softly overhead. The long hallway stretched toward the elevators. No footsteps, no movement, just the quiet glow of nightlights along the floor. The CNA stepped beside me. "Where did she go?" "I don't know," I said. I walked quickly toward the nurse station. Maybe she had returned there, but when we reached the desk, the station was empty. The computer screens glowed softly. The schedule binder still sat open where I had left it. Angela was nowhere on the floor. The CNA looked uneasy. "You saw her too, right?" she asked. "Yeah. She was standing right there." I nodded slowly. Then I opened the security camera feed on the desk computer. The hallway camera loaded first. Timestamp still running. The footage showed the corridor outside room 217. The door opened. I ran in. The CNA followed. But no one else entered the room. The hallway had been empty the entire time. I stared at the monitor for several seconds. The hallway camera replayed the same moment again. The door to room 217 opened. I ran inside. The CNA followed. And that was it. No one else entered the room. No blue scrubs. No Angela. Just the empty hallway. The CNA leaned closer to the screen. "That's not possible," she whispered. "She was standing right there." "I know," I said. My voice sounded distant even to myself, because I remembered it clearly. Angela standing beside the patient's bed, the syringe in her hand, the calm look on her face. But the camera showed nothing, just empty space. I rewound the footage again. The elevator camera. No one stepping off except earlier visitors hours before. The hallway camera. Just me and the CNA moving between rooms. The nurse station camera. Only me sitting at the computer, talking, pausing, listening, answering someone who wasn't visible on screen. The CNA slowly stepped back from the monitor. "Who were you talking to?" I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the hospital staff database on the computer. If Angela really worked here, her name would appear somewhere. I typed it into the search bar. Angela. Several names appeared, but only one result matched a nurse assigned to this floor. Angela Morris. My stomach tightened as I opened the file. The photo appeared first. Blue scrubs, dark hair tied back, the same calm smile, the same face that had been standing in front of me less than 20 minutes earlier. The CNA leaned forward. "That's her," she said. I nodded slowly, but something else on the screen caught my attention. Under employment status, it didn't say active. It said terminated. 3 years ago. I scrolled down further. Incident report attached to the file. The details were short. Night shift, medication error, wrong injection given during an emergency response. The patient had gone into cardiac arrest and died before morning. Angela Morris had been suspended immediately after the investigation. 2 weeks later, she had taken her own life. The room felt colder suddenly. The CNA stepped away from the desk. "You're kidding." I wish I was. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then the radio from the security desk crackled softly. "You guys still awake up there?" "Yeah," I said. "Why?" "I was reviewing the hallway cameras," the guard said. "Thought you might want to see something." I pulled the camera feed back onto the screen. The hallway appeared again. Quiet. Empty. But the guard rewound the footage slightly, then paused. "Look at the far end of the hall," he said. The camera zoomed slightly. At the very edge of the frame, just beyond the light spilling from the nurse station, a figure stood in the shadows. Blue scrubs, hair tied back, watching. Angela. The guard spoke quietly over the radio. "That nurse didn't leave your floor." I stared at the screen, because while the camera had caught her standing there, she wasn't looking toward the hallway. She was looking directly at me. The diner sat just off Interstate 44, the kind of place you only noticed if you were already tired enough to stop. A glowing red sign, a gravel parking lot, and windows that stayed lit long after everything else in town had gone dark. I worked the night shift there, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Most nights were predictable. Truck drivers stopping for coffee, a few travelers trying to stay awake on long drives. Sometimes a police officer from the highway patrol grabbing a slice of pie before heading back out. But between 2 and 4 in the morning, the place usually went quiet. Too quiet. That night was one of those nights. Around 2:30 a.m., the diner felt almost empty. The only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the occasional sizzle from the grill in the kitchen. Rick was working the line that night. He had been cooking there longer than I'd been alive. He barely spoke unless someone ordered food. Most of the time, he just stood behind the grill with the radio playing softly beside him. I was wiping down the counter when the jukebox at the end of the diner clicked softly. Not playing music, just the faint mechanical sound it made when someone brushed against it. I glanced over automatically. Nobody was standing there. The front door stayed closed. The small bell above it hadn't rung. I shrugged it off and kept wiping the counter. A few seconds later, something made me look up again. Booth 6. The one near the window facing the parking lot. A man was sitting there. I hadn't heard the door, but he was definitely there. Gray jacket, baseball cap pulled low, hands resting on the table, just sitting quietly and staring out the window toward the highway. For a moment I wondered if he had been there the whole time and I had simply missed him. It happens sometimes during slow shifts. Your mind wandered. You lost track of things. I grabbed a coffee pot and walked over to the booth. "Evening," I said. The man turned his head slightly. Not enough to fully face me, just enough to acknowledge I was standing there. "Coffee?" I asked. He nodded once. No smile, no words, just a small nod. I poured the coffee into the mug sitting in front of him. The steam rose between us in thin white curls. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then the man said quietly, "Long night?" His voice sounded calm, almost distant. "Yeah," I said. "Pretty slow tonight." He nodded again and looked back toward the dark parking lot outside. The highway lights glowed faintly in the distance beyond the trees. Cars passed every few minutes, headlights sliding across the glass like moving shadows. After a moment, he said something that made me pause. "I come here sometimes." I tried to remember if I had seen him before. Night shift regulars usually stood out. Truckers had favorite booths. Travelers ordered the same food every time. But I couldn't remember ever seeing this guy. "You passin' through?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He just kept staring out the window. Then he said quietly, something like that. I nodded and stepped back from the booth. "Let me know if you need anything." As I turned toward the counter, I noticed something odd. The coffee I had just poured was still completely full. The man hadn't touched it. But as I walked away, I heard his voice behind me. "Thanks for the refill." I stopped walking for a second. Refill. The word sat strangely in my head. I had just poured the coffee maybe 5 seconds earlier. The mug had still been empty when I set it down. I turned slightly to look back at the booth. The man was still sitting there, same position, hands resting on the table. The mug in front of him was still full, steam still curling upward in thin white threads. He hadn't touched it. Maybe he was joking. Some customers did that late at night. Little dry comments when they were half awake and bored on the road. Still, something about the way he had said it felt off. Not sarcastic, not friendly, just factual, like I had actually brought him a second cup. I returned to the counter and set the coffee pot down. Rick glanced up from the grill. "Got someone?" he asked. "Booth 6, I said. Rick nodded without looking toward the dining area. "Truck driver?" "Maybe," I said. The man did look like the type. Quiet, tired, passing through. Rick flipped a burger on the grill and went back to watching it cook. The radio beside him played a low country song that sounded like it had been recorded in the 70s. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The diner went back to the slow rhythm of a night shift. I wiped the counter again, refilled the sugar dispensers, checked the pie display. Then I glanced back toward booth 6. The man was still there, still staring out the window, still not touching the coffee. A pair of headlights passed slowly along the highway outside, their light sliding across the glass and briefly illuminating the inside of the booth. For just a moment, the light reflected off the mug. The coffee level hadn't changed. I picked up the coffee pot again and walked over. "You ready for anything to eat?" I asked. The man turned his head slightly again. Same small movement as before. "Not yet," he said. His voice sounded almost distracted, like he was listening to something far away. I nodded and started to step away. Then he spoke again. "You've been working here a long time." It wasn't phrased like a question. "About 3 years," I said. He nodded slowly. "Long enough to know how quiet it gets." "That's true." He looked back toward the parking lot. "You ever close here alone?" That question made me pause. "Sometimes," I said. "Depends on the schedule." He didn't respond, just kept watching the dark highway through the glass. After a moment, I went back to the counter. Rick slid the burger onto a plate and set it beneath the warming lamp. "Your guy order yet?" "No." Rick glanced toward booth 6, then back at me. "What guy?" "The one sitting there," I said, pointing. Rick followed my hand. He squinted slightly. Then he wiped his hands on a towel. "You messing with me?" "What?" "Booth 6 is empty." I turned and looked again. The man was still sitting there, same gray jacket, same baseball cap, the coffee mug in front of him, completely untouched. "He's right there," I said. Rick stepped out from behind the grill and walked halfway into the dining area. He stared directly at booth 6. For several seconds he didn't say anything. Then he turned back toward me slowly. There's nobody sitting there. For a second, I thought Rick was joking. He had that dry sense of humor sometimes during slow shifts. But he wasn't smiling. He was staring directly at booth 6 with the same expression he used when a customer tried to leave without paying. Confused, slightly annoyed. "Rick," I said slowly. "He's right there." Rick turned his head toward me. "Who?" "The guy sitting at the booth." Rick looked back again. Then he walked closer, step by step across the diner floor, right up to the aisle beside booth 6. From where I stood, I could see both of them clearly. Rick and the man in the gray jacket. Rick stopped beside the table. He leaned forward slightly. His eyes scanned the empty seat. Then he straightened and looked back at me. "There's nobody here." I felt a strange chill run through my arms, because the man was still sitting there, right in front of Rick, hands folded on the table, coffee mug untouched. He slowly turned his head toward Rick. Rick didn't react. It was like the two of them existed in different versions of the same room. "You don't see him?" I asked. Rick shook his head. "See who?" The man at the booth watched Rick for a moment. Then he looked back at me. A small smile appeared on his face. "You see?" he said quietly. Rick frowned. "What are you talking about?" I realized something then. Rick hadn't heard him speak. "You didn't hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "The guy talking." Rick sighed. "You okay tonight?" I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the coffee pot again and walked toward the booth. Rick watched me the entire time, probably thinking I had finally lost my mind during one too many overnight shifts. I stopped beside the table and poured a little more coffee into the mug. The liquid level inside the cup hadn't dropped at all, still completely full, but the man nodded slightly. "Thank you," he said. Rick was staring at me from the counter. "You're pouring coffee into an empty cup," he said. The man leaned forward slightly. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "You shouldn't listen to him." "Why not?" I asked quietly. Rick blinked. "Why not what?" The man continued speaking softly. "He doesn't understand this place the way you do." A truck roared past on the highway outside. The headlights flashed across the diner windows. For a brief second, the reflection lit up the booth, and in that moment I noticed something strange. The reflection of the table appeared on the glass, the reflection of the mug, the reflection of the booth seat, but there was no reflection of the man sitting there. The light passed. The diner went dim again. The man watched me carefully. "You noticed," he said. My throat suddenly felt dry. Behind me, Rick spoke again. "Seriously, who are you talking to?" Before I could answer, the bell above the diner door rang loudly. Both Rick and I turned toward the entrance. The door had just opened. Cold night air rushed inside. A state trooper stepped through the doorway. He glanced around the diner, then nodded toward the counter. "Evening." "Evening," Rick replied. I turned back toward booth 6. The man in the gray jacket was still sitting there, still watching me, still smiling. The bell above the door echoed through the diner. Cold air followed the state trooper inside as he closed the door behind him. He stamped his boots once against the floor mat and looked around the room. "Evening," he said. Rick lifted a hand from the grill. "Evening, officer." The trooper walked toward the counter and sat on one of the stools. I glanced back toward booth 6. The man in the gray jacket was still there, still watching me, still smiling slightly. But when I looked back toward the counter, the trooper was staring at me with a puzzled expression. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Just a long shift." Rick slid a cup of coffee toward the officer. "Same as usual?" The trooper nodded. I forced myself to look away from booth 6 and walked behind the counter. But the strange feeling in my chest wouldn't go away, because even without looking directly at him, I could still feel the man watching me. After a moment, the trooper spoke again. "You get many customers this late?" "Not really," Rick said. "Maybe a truck driver now and then." The trooper glanced around the diner. Only 4 booths, all empty, except one, at least from where I stood. I slowly turned my head toward booth 6 again. The man lifted his mug slightly, like he was toasting someone across the room. But the coffee inside still hadn't moved, still full, still steaming faintly. I walked toward the booth again before I could stop myself. Rick watched me with the same confused look as before. The trooper followed my movement with his eyes. "You expecting someone?" he asked. I didn't answer. I stopped beside the table. The man leaned back slightly in the booth. "You see," he said softly, "someone new arrived." His eyes flicked toward the trooper at the counter. "Do you know him?" he asked. "Yes," I said quietly. "He comes here most nights." The man nodded slowly. "Good." Then he leaned forward slightly. "And you still don't understand why I'm here." The words sent a cold shiver down my spine. "What do you mean?" The man tapped one finger lightly against the table. 3 years ago, he said, someone died behind this diner. My stomach tightened instantly, because I remembered that story. Everyone in town did. A traveler had been stabbed in the parking lot late at night. The case had never been solved. The man at the booth watched my reaction carefully. "You remember now," he said, "don't you?" Behind me, Rick called out, "You seriously talking to that booth again?" I ignored him. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. The man's smile faded. "Because," he said quietly, "tonight someone else is supposed to die here." At that moment, the trooper's chair scraped loudly against the floor. He stood up and walked toward us. "You two all right over here?" he asked. I turned toward him, but when I looked back at the booth again, the man was gone. The seat was empty. The mug still sat on the table, and for the first time since he appeared, the coffee inside it was half gone. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. The booth was empty, completely empty. Rick walked over slowly, wiping his hands on a towel. "You see," he said, "I told you there was nobody sitting there. But I wasn't looking at the seat. I was looking at the coffee mug. The dark liquid inside had clearly dropped. Half the cup was gone." Rick noticed it too, his eyebrows pulled together. "You drink that?" "No." He picked up the mug and tilted it slightly. "Still warm, still fresh." "Did that trooper order coffee already?" Rick asked. "No," I said. The trooper stepped closer to the booth. "What's going on?" Rick shrugged. "She keeps saying someone's sitting here." The trooper looked at me. "Ma'am?" I hesitated. Then I pointed at the mug. "That was full a minute ago." The trooper looked down at it. "Looks like someone drank it." "Exactly. But nobody's here." The three of us stood there in silence for a moment. The hum of the refrigerator filled the diner. Outside, a truck roared past on the highway. Headlights slid across the windows and disappeared again. The trooper pulled the booth seat out and sat down. "Let's slow down a second," he said. "You said a man was sitting here?" "Yes." "What did he look like?" "Gray jacket, baseball cap, maybe mid-40s. The trooper's expression changed slightly. "How long ago?" 10 minutes, maybe?" Rick shook his head. "There's been nobody here all night." The trooper leaned back in the booth and looked around the diner. Then he glanced toward the large front window that faced the parking lot. "You said he mentioned something about a murder?" I nodded slowly. "In the parking lot, 3 years ago." Rick stopped moving. He stared at me. "You're kidding." The trooper looked at Rick. "You know about that?" Rick let out a long breath. "Yeah." He nodded toward the parking lot outside. "Happened right out there. A traveler passing through town. Everybody stabbed him and took his wallet." The trooper frowned. "Case was never solved." Rick rubbed the back of his neck. "Guy came in here before it happened. Sat at that same booth." The room suddenly felt colder. The trooper looked back at me. "You remember anything else about him?" I swallowed. "He said someone was supposed to die here tonight." Rick laughed nervously. "Okay, that's not funny." But the trooper wasn't laughing. He stood up and walked toward the counter. "Let's check something." He pulled up the security monitor that showed the parking lot camera. The black and white footage flickered softly. Empty parking lot, 2 pickup trucks, and the long, dark stretch of highway beyond the diner. The trooper rewound the footage. The screen showed the diner entrance from 20 minutes earlier. Rick cooking behind the counter. Me wiping the counter. Booth 6 empty. He fast-forwarded slowly. Still empty. Then the trooper paused the video. "Wait." Rick and I leaned closer to the monitor. The camera angle showed the parking lot directly outside the diner windows. The door never opened. Nobody walked inside. But standing just beyond the glow of the diner lights was a man. Gray jacket, baseball cap. He stood completely still in the darkness of the parking lot, watching the diner through the glass. The trooper zoomed the footage slightly. The man didn't move, didn't walk, didn't blink, just stood there. Rick leaned closer to the screen. How long's he been there? The trooper checked the timestamp. Since before I arrived. My stomach tightened, because I suddenly understood something. The man hadn't been sitting in the booth, not really. He had been standing outside the entire time, watching us, watching me. The trooper rewound the footage again. The same image appeared, the man standing in the darkness. Then he slowly raised one hand, not waving, not knocking, just lifting it slightly, like he was pointing. The trooper froze the frame. "Where's he pointing?" Rick asked. No one answered, because we all realized it at the same moment. The man wasn't pointing at the diner. He was pointing directly at me. Night shift security is mostly routine. You walk the same floors, check the same doors, watch the same quiet hallways on camera. After a few months, your brain stops paying attention to most of it. Nothing ever happens. The building I worked in sat just outside downtown Indianapolis. 12 floors, mostly accounting firms, small tech companies, and a law office that stayed open later than everyone else. But by midnight, the place was always empty. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and most nights, the only real sounds were the vending machine humming and the soft click of the elevator resetting on the ground floor. The security desk sat in the main lobby. From there, I could see three things: the front glass entrance, the elevator bank, and the hallway that led toward the stairwell. Everything else came through the camera monitors. 24 cameras, parking lot, hallways, elevators, emergency exits. Around 1 a.m., the building usually settled into complete silence. Even the street traffic outside thinned out. That night was no different. I had just finished a quick walk through the lobby when I sat back down in the chair behind the security desk. The monitor wall glowed in the dark room. Nothing moving. Parking lot empty. Elevator idle on floor 1. Perfectly normal. I opened the logbook and wrote the time. 1:17 a.m. Routine check complete. Then I leaned back and took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold. And that was when the intercom beeped. A sharp electronic chirp echoed through the lobby. I froze for a second, because almost nobody used the intercom at night. The speaker crackled. Then a man's voice came through, calm, almost casual. "Hey, security." I leaned toward the console. "Yes? Can you let me in?" I looked up at the glass entrance. The outside lights were on. The parking lot stretched out beyond them, empty and quiet. "I don't see anyone at the door," I said. The voice came back immediately. "I'm standing right here." I leaned forward and pulled up the front entrance camera. Black and white footage filled the monitor. The sidewalk, the door, the empty parking lot. No one. "You're not on camera," I said. There was a small pause. Then the man answered. "That's weird." His voice sounded slightly amused now. "Maybe your camera angle is off." I zoomed the camera in. Still nothing. Just the glass door reflecting the lobby lights. "Sir," I said, "the building is closed. You need a key card to enter after 10. Another short silence. Then he spoke again. I forgot mine. "What company are you with?" "Fourth floor," he said instantly. "Accounting." I frowned, because I knew every company in that building, and there was no accounting firm on the 4th floor. I glanced back down at the console. The intercom light was still glowing, active, which didn't make sense, because earlier that night, maintenance had shut the entire system down. I remembered the technician saying it clearly. "Intercom will be offline until morning." I looked back at the glowing button, then slowly pressed the microphone again. "Sir, how are you using this intercom?" The voice answered almost immediately. "You opened the line." A cold feeling crept across the back of my neck, because I hadn't opened anything, and the system shouldn't have had power at all. I stared at the console for a few seconds. The green light on the intercom button was still glowing. That alone didn't make sense. The maintenance guy had shut the entire intercom system down earlier that night. I watched him do it. He opened the metal panel under the desk, pulled the fuse, and even wrote a note in the logbook. "System offline until morning." But the voice was still there. "Security?" the man said again. "You still there?" I cleared my throat. "Yes, I'm here." I leaned closer to the microphone. "If you're outside, step directly in front of the door camera." A short pause. Then the man answered, "I am." I turned back to the monitor. The front entrance camera filled the screen, the glass doors, the empty sidewalk, the parking lot lights glowing across the asphalt. No one. I adjusted the zoom. Still nothing. "Sir," I said slowly, "I still don't see you." Another pause. This one longer. Then the man spoke again. "You probably can." His voice sounded different now, lower, almost amused. "You're just looking at the wrong screen." A chill moved across my shoulders. Before I could respond, one of the monitors behind me flickered. Camera 12, third floor hallway. A small movement crossed the screen. I turned in my chair immediately. The hallway camera showed a long corridor lined with office doors. Fluorescent lights buzzed quietly overhead. And for a split second, something had just moved past the far end of the hallway. I rewound the footage. The clip rolled back a few seconds. The hallway appeared again, empty. Then the frame shifted. A figure crossed the camera, too fast to see clearly, but definitely human. My stomach tightened. Nobody should have been inside the building. The cleaning crew left hours ago. Every door downstairs had been locked. I grabbed the radio on the desk. "Control to building check." No response. Of course not. There was no one else on shift, just me. Behind me, the intercom crackled again. "You see me yet?" I slowly turned back toward the console. "You said you were outside," I said. "I am." At that exact moment, another monitor blinked. Camera 9, second floor stairwell. Movement again. The same shape, walking slowly across the landing. My pulse started beating harder. "Sir," I said carefully, "are you inside the building?" The man laughed quietly. "No." Then, after a moment, he added, "Not yet." I turned back toward the camera wall. The hallway feed flickered again, and this time, the figure moved closer to the camera. Clear enough to tell one thing. Someone was definitely walking through the building, but no doors had opened, and no one had come through the entrance. The intercom crackled again. "Can you open the door?" I looked back at the empty entrance camera, and for the first time since the call started, I felt completely certain of one thing. Whoever was talking to me on that intercom was not standing outside the building. I leaned forward in my chair and replayed the hallway footage again. The corridor appeared on the screen. Fluorescent lights, closed office doors, completely still. Then the frame shifted. The figure appeared again. This time it moved slower, walking across the far end of the hallway. Tall, broad shoulders, human. My mouth went dry, because there was no way someone should have been on the third floor. Every exterior door downstairs was locked, and the stairwell alarm would have triggered if someone forced it open. Behind me, the intercom crackled. "You still there?" The voice sounded patient, like someone waiting for a friend to unlock the door. I kept my eyes on the monitors. "Yes," I said, then opened the door. I ignored the request. Instead, I switched the camera feed to the stairwell on the third floor. The image appeared instantly. Empty. No one on the landing. No movement. I switched back to the hallway camera. The figure was gone. My heartbeat thumped harder in my ears. "Did you see me?" the voice asked. "No," I said. Another quiet laugh came through the speaker. "That's strange." Then the man said something that made my stomach tighten. "I thought you were watching." At that exact moment, another monitor flickered. Camera 9, second floor hallway. I turned toward it immediately. There it was again, the same shape moving down the corridor, walking slowly toward the stairwell door. My chest felt tight. The third floor camera had just shown someone. Now the second floor camera was showing someone too, which meant one thing. Whoever it was moving downward through the building, toward the lobby. The intercom crackled again. "Still looking at the cameras?" The voice sounded almost amused. "How do you know that?" I asked. "Your security." A pause. "That's what security does." I switched to the lobby hallway camera. The corridor leading toward the security desk appeared on the screen. Empty. Completely empty. I glanced back at the entrance camera. Still no one outside the door. The intercom light glowed steadily. The voice spoke again. "You're taking a long time." My hand hovered over the radio. even though I knew no one would answer. "Where are you right now?" I asked. "Outside," the man replied. At that exact moment, another monitor blinked. Camera 4, the stairwell on the first floor. I slowly turned my head toward the screen. The landing door was swinging slightly, like it had just been pushed open, but the camera showed no one there. Then the door stopped moving. Silence filled the security room. My pulse hammered in my chest, because if someone had just come down the stairwell, there was only one place they could go next, the hallway behind the security desk. The intercom crackled again. The voice sounded softer now. "Can you open the door for me?" I turned slowly in my chair and looked over my shoulder at the dark hallway behind me. For a moment, nothing moved. Then one of the lobby cameras flickered, and something crossed the frame, right behind the security desk. I kept staring at the monitor. The lobby camera replayed the same short clip. Something had crossed the frame behind the security desk, but when I turned around, the hallway was empty, completely empty. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing. Behind me, the intercom clicked again. "You're still there, right?" The man's voice sounded calm, patient, like someone waiting outside a locked door. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened the system control panel on the console. The maintenance technician had written the shutdown time clearly. 10:02 p.m., intercom offline. I checked the power indicator. The system had no power, no signal, no active connection, and yet the voice continued. "Security?" I slowly pressed the microphone button again. "How are you using the intercom?" Silence for a moment. Then the man answered. "You opened the line." My stomach tightened. "I didn't." Another pause. Then the man spoke again, almost casually. "Yes, you did." At that moment, another monitor flickered. Camera 2, lobby interior. I turned toward it immediately. The camera pointed directly at the glass entrance doors. Outside, the parking lot lights glowed over empty asphalt. Inside, the lobby floor reflected the overhead lights. Then something appeared, a shape, standing directly outside the doors, tall, still, perfectly centered in front of the camera. I leaned closer to the screen. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there, watching the building. My pulse started racing, because when I looked up from the monitor and stared at the real glass entrance across the lobby, there was no one there. The doorway was empty, the parking lot beyond it silent. But on the screen, the man was clearly visible. Gray jacket, baseball cap, standing only a few feet from the door. The intercom crackled again. "See?" the voice said softly. "I told you I was here." I couldn't take my eyes off the monitor. The man on the screen slowly raised one hand, not waving, just lifting it slightly toward the door, waiting. The voice spoke again. "Can you open it now?" My hands felt cold, because the door lock system sat right beside my console. One button, that was all it would take. But something felt wrong, very wrong. I forced myself to look away from the monitor. Slowly, I turned my head toward the real entrance doors across the lobby, still empty, no man, no movement. Then I looked back at the camera screen again. The man was gone. The space outside the doors was empty. The intercom crackled softly. "You almost opened it." The voice sounded closer now, lower, like it wasn't coming from the console anymore. It was coming from somewhere in the lobby, right behind me. I didn't move for several seconds. The security room suddenly felt much smaller. The monitors hummed softly behind me. Every camera feed showed the same quiet building. Empty hallways, silent elevators, dark offices. But the voice had not come from the console. I was sure of that. It sounded closer, much closer. Slowly, I turned my head toward the lobby behind the desk. The hallway lights were still on. The vending machine glowed faintly against the wall. Nothing moved. No footsteps, no shadows, just the quiet buzz of fluorescent lights. I swallowed and turned back toward the monitors. The lobby camera filled the center screen. The glass entrance doors, the empty parking lot outside. Everything looked normal. But then something changed. Movement. Right behind the security desk. I leaned forward. The camera angle showed the back of my chair, my shoulders, the top of my head. I was sitting there, exactly where I was now. But behind me, someone else was standing. Tall, wearing a gray jacket, baseball cap pulled low. My chest tightened instantly, because I had not heard the door open. I had not heard footsteps, and the hallway behind me had been empty only seconds ago. The man on the monitor stood completely still, right behind my chair, watching me, watching the back of my head. The intercom crackled again, but this time the sound did not come from the console. It came from somewhere inside the room, right behind me. "You see me now." The voice was quiet, almost satisfied. My hands slowly moved away from the desk. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because the camera showed exactly what would happen if I did. The man leaned closer on the screen, slowly lowering his head toward my shoulder, like he was about to whisper something. The monitors flickered. For a moment the image distorted. Static rolled across the screen. Then the picture returned. Only one person was sitting at the desk again. Me. The space behind my chair was empty, completely empty. I stared at the screen for a long time, waiting for the shape to appear again. But nothing moved, just the silent lobby, the empty hallway, the dark parking lot outside. Finally, I reached for the logbook. My hand was shaking slightly. I wrote one short line under the previous entry. 1:47 a.m., possible security system malfunction. I closed the book. Then I looked back up at the camera wall and froze, because the entrance camera now showed someone standing outside the building, perfectly centered in front of the doors, gray jacket, baseball cap. And this time, he was looking directly into the camera, waiting for me to open the door. Night shifts at roadside diners follow a strange rhythm. The first few hours are busy. Truck drivers, late travelers, people trying to beat the highway traffic before midnight. But after 2 in the morning, everything slows down. The diner I worked at sat just off Highway 63 in central Missouri. One of those places you only notice because the neon sign glows against the dark fields around it. Open 24 hours, 4 booths, 8 counter seats, a jukebox that hadn't worked properly in years, and one tired employee behind the counter trying to stay awake until sunrise. That employee was me. My shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. Most nights I spent the quiet hours doing the same things over and over, wiping the counter, refilling the coffee pot, writing small notes in the logbook my manager insisted we keep. By 2:30, the diner usually went completely silent. Even the highway traffic thinned out. Just the soft humming of refrigerators and the faint buzz of the neon sign outside. That night felt exactly like every other night. At 2:41 a.m., I finished cleaning the grill and poured myself another cup of coffee. It had already been sitting on the burner too long. Bitter, burned, but strong enough to keep me awake. I leaned against the counter and looked out the front window. Beyond the parking lot was nothing but empty road and dark farmland. No cars, no headlights, just darkness stretching out to the horizon. I remember thinking how quiet it felt. Too quiet even for a night shift. Then the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp in the empty diner. I looked up just as the glass door swung open. A man stepped inside, mid-40s maybe, wearing a gray jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He paused for a moment, just inside the doorway, looking around the diner like he was taking in the place. Then he walked slowly to one of the booths near the counter, the one closest to where I stood. He slid into the seat without saying anything. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then he nodded once toward the coffee pot. "Coffee," he said. His voice was calm, friendly even. I grabbed a mug and filled it from the pot. When I set it down in front of him, steam curled up into the air between us. "Long drive?" I asked. "Something like that." He wrapped both hands around the mug, but didn't drink, just held it there like he was warming his fingers. The diner went quiet again. For a few minutes neither of us spoke. Then he glanced around the room slowly. "Pretty quiet tonight." "Usually is after 2, I said. He nodded. "Night shifts are strange." I shrugged slightly. "You get used to it." The man looked at me for a moment longer. Then he smiled faintly. "No," he said. "You really don't." Something about the way he said it made the silence feel heavier. I wiped the counter again, even though it was already clean. "You pass through here often?" I asked. He looked down at the coffee mug. "I used to. Years ago." He still hadn't taken a single sip. The steam from the coffee had already started fading. Outside, a truck passed somewhere far down the highway. The sound rolled across the fields and disappeared again. The man looked back up at me. "Tell me something," he said. "Do you ever get the feeling you weren't actually alone during these shifts?" I laughed quietly. Not really. You'd be surprised. I raised an eyebrow. Why? The man leaned back slightly in the booth and looked around the diner again. Then he said something that made the room feel colder. Because sometimes people think they were alone all night. He paused, then added softly, but the cameras remember it differently. For a while, the diner returned to its usual silence. The man sat in the booth across from the counter, hands around the mug of coffee. He still hadn't taken a sip. I busied myself wiping the counter again, even though it was already spotless. Outside the window, the highway stretched across the dark farmland. A pair of headlights passed in the distance and disappeared again. The man watched the road for a moment. "Long nights out here," he said. "Sometimes," I replied. "You get used to the quiet." He nodded slowly, like he was thinking about that. "Quiet can be strange," he said. "How so?" He glanced around the diner again. The empty booths, the dark jukebox in the corner, the humming refrigerator behind the counter. When places get too quiet, people start noticing things. I shrugged. Like what? He looked back at me. Little movements, sounds that don't belong, things that were probably always there, but nobody paid attention before. I poured myself another cup of coffee. "You make night shifts sound creepy." He smiled faintly. "They can be." The steam above his mug had completely faded now. The coffee should have been getting cold, but he still held the mug the same way, both hands around it, not drinking. I leaned against the counter. "So what brings you out this late?" "Driving," he said. "Been alone a long time." "You passing through?" He nodded. "Something like that." We sat in silence again for a moment. Then he asked a strange question. "How long have you worked here?" "About 8 months." "Always nights?" "Mostly." "That's a long time to sit here alone." I laughed lightly. "You'd be surprised how boring it is. Most nights I'm just waiting for sunrise." The man looked toward the ceiling where one of the security cameras hung. "Do you ever check those?" "The cameras?" "Yeah. Sometimes. They're mostly for the manager." He leaned back slightly in the booth. "You probably shouldn't look at them too often." "Why not?" He thought for a second before answering. "Because cameras remember things differently than people do." I raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" Instead of answering, he nodded toward the wall behind me. "Go ahead," he said. "Take a look." I turned around in my chair and looked at the small monitor above the kitchen door. It showed the diner from a wide angle. The counter, the booths, the entrance door, everything in grainy black and white. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then I leaned closer to the screen. My chair was there, the counter, the coffee pot. But booth 3, the booth where the man was sitting, was empty. I stared at the screen, then slowly turned back toward him. He was still there, still holding the mug, watching me carefully. I looked back at the monitor again. The booth was still empty, no movement, no one sitting there. I turned back to him once more. The man smiled slightly. "See?" he said softly. "I told you the cameras remember things differently." For a moment, I thought the monitor had to be malfunctioning. The camera above the kitchen door was old, grainy, black and white. It wouldn't have been the first time it glitched. I looked at the screen again. The counter was there, my chair, the coffee pot, the entrance door, everything exactly where it should be, except booth 3. Booth 3 was empty. I slowly turned my head back toward the man sitting across from me. He hadn't moved, still leaning slightly forward, still holding the coffee mug between both hands, watching my reaction. I turned back to the monitor, still empty. My stomach tightened. "You see it?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. Instead, I stood up and walked closer to the screen. The security monitor buzzed softly. The image flickered slightly as the camera adjusted its brightness, but nothing changed. Booth 3 remained empty. I looked over my shoulder again. The man was still sitting there, exactly where he had been the entire time. "Okay," I said slowly. "That's weird." He smiled a little. "Cameras do that sometimes." "What?" "They forget things." I crossed my arms. "People don't just disappear on camera." "Are you sure?" He tilted his head slightly. "You ever watch old security footage?" "Not really." "You should." I hesitated, then walked behind the counter and reached for the small control panel under the monitor. The system could rewind a few hours of footage. Mostly the manager used it when someone complained about a missing wallet or a wrong bill. But it worked well enough. I pressed the rewind button. The timestamp rolled backward. 3:15 a.m., 3:02 a.m., 2:58 a.m. I stopped the footage. That was around the time the man had walked in. The diner appeared on the screen again. The counter, the empty booths, the entrance door. The time in the corner ticked forward slowly. 2:46 a.m., 2:47 a.m. I leaned closer to the screen, waiting to see the door open, waiting to see the man walk inside. But the door never moved. The bell above the entrance never rang. The diner stayed completely empty. My throat went dry. The timestamp continued. 2:48 a.m., 2:49 a.m. Still nothing. No one entering. No one sitting down. Just me behind the counter, standing exactly where I had been earlier. I slowly looked back over my shoulder. The man sat calmly in the booth, watching me again. "Did you find it?" he asked. My voice felt tight when I answered. "You never walked in." He nodded slightly. "That's what the camera thinks." I stared at him. "That's not possible." "Why not?" "Because I heard the door." "You heard something," he said. "That's not the same thing." The room suddenly felt colder. I looked back at the screen again. The footage continued playing. 3:10 a.m., 3:20 a.m. On the monitor, I could see myself talking, laughing once, leaning against the counter, moving my hands like I was having a conversation, but there was no one sitting across from me. The booth stayed empty the entire time. I felt a slow chill spread down my back, because the person on the screen looked exactly like me, and he was clearly talking to someone the camera could not see. Behind me, the man spoke again. "You look nervous." I turned around slowly. "Who are you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the front window where the faint gray light of early morning was starting to creep across the horizon. "Sunrise is coming," he said quietly. Then he looked back at me. "That's when things get interesting." I kept staring at the monitor. The footage kept playing. On the screen, I watched myself move around the diner, pouring coffee, leaning on the counter, talking, laughing once. But the booth across from me stayed empty the entire time. No one ever sat there. No one ever walked in. The door never opened. I felt a slow pressure building in my chest, because I knew exactly when he had arrived. I remembered the bell above the door ringing. I remembered the sound of his boots on the tile floor. I remembered placing the mug of coffee in front of him. Every detail felt clear in my head, but the camera didn't remember any of it. Behind me, the man shifted slightly in the booth. The seat creaked. I turned slowly. He was still there, exactly where he had been for the last hour, watching me. "You're quiet," he said. I forced a breath out of my lungs. "The camera says you were never here." He nodded slightly. "Yes, that's what it says." "Then how are you sitting there?" He looked down at the coffee mug again. The surface of the coffee had gone completely still, cold now. "I told you," he said calmly. "Cameras remember things differently." I shook my head. "That doesn't make sense." He leaned back slightly in the booth. "Maybe the camera remembers the truth." The words hung in the air between us. I felt my stomach tighten. "What truth?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. Not full daylight yet, but the darkness was starting to thin. A faint gray line sat on the horizon beyond the highway. "Sunrise changes things," he said quietly. I followed his gaze toward the window. A truck roared past on the highway. Its headlights swept across the diner and vanished again. When I looked back, the man was watching me carefully. "Have you ever wondered," he asked slowly, "what the camera would show if you weren't here?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" He tapped one finger lightly against the mug. "Night shifts can play tricks on people. Too much silence. Too much time alone." I crossed my arms. "I'm not imagining you." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not." Then he asked something that made my skin crawl. "Do you remember your last customer before tonight?" I thought about it. A truck driver around midnight. Paid cash. Left before 1. "Yeah," I said. "Why?" The man nodded slowly. "Because that's the last person the camera remembers." My chest tightened. "What?" He leaned forward slightly. "And after that," he continued quietly, "the camera shows you standing here alone. I turned quickly back to the monitor. The playback timeline continued rolling. 1:12 a.m., 1:30 a.m., 2 a.m. The diner remained empty except for me. I stood behind the counter the entire time, pouring coffee, walking in small circles, sometimes stopping and talking toward the booth. Talking to someone who wasn't there. My throat felt dry. "That's impossible," I whispered. Behind me the man spoke again. "Is it?" I turned around. He was still sitting there, still calm, still watching me like he had all night. "Why are you here?" I asked. He studied my face for a moment. Then he said something very quietly. "I stayed here once. Until morning." The words stayed in the air between us. I stayed here once, until morning. For a moment I didn't know how to respond. The sky outside the diner window had turned pale gray. The long stretch of highway beyond the parking lot was slowly coming back to life. A truck passed, then another. Morning was close. I turned back toward the monitor again. The footage was still playing. The camera showed the diner exactly as it had been all night. The counter, the empty booths, and me, standing behind the counter talking to someone who wasn't there. I felt a slow, heavy pressure settle in my chest. "How long ago?" I asked quietly. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the front window again, watching the faint light spreading across the fields. "Years," he said finally. "I used to drive through here all the time." He glanced back at me. One night I stopped for coffee. The way he said it felt strange, like he was remembering something that had already happened. "What happened?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. "Nothing special. Just a long conversation. With the guy working the night shift." My stomach tightened. And then? Morning came. He looked down at the coffee mug again, still untouched. And the camera showed he'd been alone all night. The diner suddenly felt colder. "You're saying this happened before?" He nodded slowly. "More than once." I looked back at the monitor. The timestamp read 5:59 a.m. Sunrise was seconds away. On the screen, the version of me in the footage leaned on the counter, talking, smiling, nodding like someone was sitting across from him. But the booth stayed empty. My throat felt tight. "Then who were you talking to?" I asked. The man studied my face carefully. Then he said something very softly. "The same person you are." A faint line of sunlight suddenly cut across the diner floor. The sun had finally risen above the fields. The first true daylight of morning filled the room. I blinked and turned toward the window. When I looked back at the booth, the man was gone. The seat was empty. The coffee mug sat untouched on the table, exactly where it had been all night. For a moment I just stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the diner. Then I slowly looked back at the security monitor. The camera showed the same empty room, the same quiet booths, the same counter, and one tired night shift worker standing alone behind it, just like every other morning. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to decide whether anything had really happened at all. Then the bell above the diner door rang. I turned quickly toward the entrance. The door swung open. A man stepped inside. Mid-40s, gray jacket, baseball cap pulled low. He paused just inside the doorway and looked around the diner. Then he walked slowly to the booth near the counter, the one closest to where I stood. He sat down, looked up at me, and nodded once toward the coffee pot. "Coffee," he said. Night shifts have a strange way of changing ordinary places. Gas stations, motels, hospitals, warehouses, roadside diners. During the day, these places are busy, lights on, people everywhere. But late at night, when the parking lots are empty, when the hallways are quiet, when you are the only one still working, sometimes someone shows up. A customer, a visitor, someone asking for help. And in that moment, you have to decide whether to trust them. Sometimes that decision doesn't matter, because by the time you realize something is wrong, it's already too late. If you're still awake right now, and you're watching this during your own night shift, stay safe out there, because the next story might happen somewhere just like where you work.